Hidden away in a housing estate in Coety village, a small community in Bridgend County Borough in South Wales, you'll find the facade of a medieval castle peeking over an otherwise unassuming hedge. Its origins stretch back more than 900 years to a time when the Normans were invading this region. Since then, it's been built on, upgraded, invaded, fought over, abandoned, and left to ruin. It's called Coity Castle, and I'm going to tell you about it, so if you're ever lucky enough to visit, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. In my last video, I visited Ogmore and spoke about how the castle there was built during the Norman conquest of Glamorgan by Sir William de Glyndwr, one of the legendary 12 Knights of Glamorgan. These were the men said to have followed Robert Fitzhamon during his conquest of South Wales. Well, Coity Castle was founded by a contemporary of his, Sir Pont de Tuberville, another one of the 12 Knights. He also apparently had the nickname The Demon. It's not exactly clear how he got that name, but I can't imagine it was because he was a nice guy. Despite its still quite grand medieval appearance, Coity Castle started life in the early 12th century as a Norman earth ringwork. Essentially, this was a raised earth fortification surrounded by a ditch and enclosed by a wooden palisade, a fortified wooden fence. Then, in the late 12th century, the castle was significantly reinforced. The wooden defences were replaced with stone, and the keep and the curtain wall, shown here, were built. Now, the castle has been expanded and built upon so many times over the centuries that the lines between the original 12th century stone structure and the later additions are quite blurry, but I'll do my best to make sense of it. Now, it might help to first show you this illustration of the castle. This is how it might have looked in the 16th century. You've got the inner ward here and the outer ward here, which I've just walked through. The different colours represent different periods of construction. We have light grey for the 12th century, dark grey for the 14th century, yellow for the 15th century, and red for the 16th century. I'll be starting by here and walking through the middle gatehouse. Like much of what's still visible today, this structure is not original. It was added in the 14th century. It's also worth noting that while you can walk straight in today, when this gatehouse was first built, the entrance would have only been accessible by a drawbridge. That's because the moat surrounding the castle originally enclosed the inner ward completely. The section in front of the middle gatehouse was filled in during the 16th century, making access easier. Just moving into the inner ward now, you might immediately notice that despite its overall small size, the castle seems particularly vertical. Not much of the upper floors remain now, but the chimneys really give you a sense that this was quite tall in its heyday. By its later life, Coity Castle was less about being a hard military stronghold and more about comfort, status, and residential use. To that end, it was significantly expanded over the centuries, but it was still confined by the footprint of the original Norman fortification, and so one obvious way to expand was straight up. I should also mention that while we were at Coety, the weather was all over the place, and it was around now that it really started raining, so we took refuge in the northeast gatehouse. Like other castles in the area, Coety was attacked and besieged by Owain Glyndŵr in the early 15th century during his Welsh uprising. At the time, it was defended by Sir Lawrence Beckerers, at least I think that's how you pronounce his name, who had acquired the castle after the male Tuberville line died out. The siege led to unsuccessful rescue attempts by King Henry IV and his son, Prince Henry, the future Henry V. The castle was significantly damaged during Glyndwr's attack, and it seems to have remained in that state until it was later acquired by William Gamage, again, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who carried out extensive repairs. But Gamage didn't get Coety so easily. He actually had to besiege the castle himself in an attempt to forcibly remove Joan Vernon, another claimant who had taken up residence there. For doing this, Gamage was imprisoned in the Tower of London by Henry IV, which means either Joan Vernon's claim was being taken seriously, or Henry just didn't like Gamage taking the law into his own hands, or possibly both. Gamage was only released after Henry IV died, and after that he finally acquired the castle. Information on exactly how he managed this is hard to come by, but seeing as there's no indication that there was a second siege, it seems to have been through litigation, through legal means rather than violence. Now, I mention all of that not only because it's interesting, but because it was Gamage who built the gatehouse we used to shelter from the rain. Anyway, when the rain finally stopped, we were able to get a proper look at the keep. Now, the keep was not just a military tower. In the early days of the castle, it would have been the safest and most prestigious place to live. When it was first built in the early 12th century, it would have consisted of the ground floor and the 2 floors above, shown here. The ground floor acted as a basement, while the upper floors were used as residential living space. And while you can walk freely into the basement today, originally it would have only been accessed through a hatch from the first floor. The first floor itself would have been reached by an external staircase. In the 14th century, this central octagonal pillar was added to both the ground floor and the first floors. It supported new rib vaults, which are still visible today, although the rib vaults on the first floor were more ornate than the ones that we can still see. I guess, being that these were in a basement, they didn't care as much for how they looked. Around this time, this annex was built. As well as providing more space, it also added latrines or garderobes to the keep, basically medieval toilets, which I'm sure was a very welcome upgrade. Then in the 16th century, the keep was upgraded again with the addition of a 3rd floor and larger Tudor-style windows. As I mentioned earlier, by this point, Coity was becoming less important as a military stronghold and was being adapted more for comfort and residential use. And so more space, bigger rooms, larger, brighter windows, they were all on the building agenda. With the addition of that 3rd floor, the keep reached around 18 meters in height. For any Americans watching, that's just shy of 60 feet tall. Now in the 14th century, when Coity Castle was being transformed into a much more comfortable residence, a new domestic range was built along the south side of the inner ward. That's pretty much most of what you're seeing here. Although again, it was significantly expanded in the following centuries, so much of the upper structure was built later. In simple terms, a domestic range is a row of rooms used for daily life, so things like the hall, service rooms, storage rooms, kitchen. This structure here is the chapel, although that wasn't completed until the 15th century. This area here was the working end of the castle, so these are the remains of the kitchen and service rooms, so the place where food was prepared, stores were kept, and the day-to-day running of the castle household took place. You can also see that there were further floors above with more rooms. These were most likely used for lodging and other household accommodation. The remains of a malting kiln can be seen here as well. This was used to dry germinated barley, turning it into malt, which would then be used for brewing ale. At the centre of the domestic range was the hall, set above a vaulted undercroft. The undercroft would have been used for storage. So where I'm standing is not the hall itself. The hall was on the floor above. The hall, of course, was the main public room of the castle, where meals and ceremonies and meetings would have taken place. That gated entranceway on the other side is one of 2 staircases to the upper floors, and you can imagine servants would be taking food from the kitchen through this undercroft and up those stairs to the hall. Similar to the keep, another floor was added in the 16th century, expanding the living quarters above the hall and service rooms. Not much really remains of this, but the tall chimney stacks that are still visible were built at this time. Now, I do have to say, when you're standing in the undercroft, in the footprint of the hall, it is quite small for a castle of this size. But then again, I don't have a castle and I don't have a hall, so who am I to critique the size of anyone else's? This passage here was effectively the main internal corridor of the domestic range. It allowed people to move from the service rooms, past the undercroft, and around towards the chapel. You can still see the remains of the rib vaulting on the walls of the corridor, and I don't quite know why, but there was something about these rib vaults that really made me feel like I was walking through a medieval castle's corridor. I mean, I know I literally am walking through a medieval castle's corridor here, but that little detail just really helps to visualize it. Just around the corner, we have the second set of stairs to the upper levels on the right, and then finally the corridor ends at the chapel. Now, the chapel probably started construction in the 14th century, but wasn't completed until the 15th. It's worth noting that this wasn't like a village church. This was the private chapel for the castle household. It was actually arranged over 2 floors, with the ground floor accessible from the inner ward, and the first floor reached either from inside the domestic range or by a small staircase within the chapel itself. Like other buildings in the castle, the ground floor of the chapel was most likely used for storage, with the first floor being used as the actual chapel. That large gap there is the chapel window, which I'm sure would have looked very heavenly, catching the rising sun in those halcyon 15th century days. And And with the chapel, that probably concludes the inner ward. Actually, there was this space next to the chapel, which was walled off, but I haven't really been able to figure out what it was for. Perhaps they were planning to build something here and never got around to it. I'm not actually sure. On the castle plans, it's literally just a walled off empty space. There is also the footprint of quite a large rectangular building next to the keep. The date of its construction is unknown and its purpose is not clear with any certainty, but some sources speculate that it may have been another medieval hall. Perhaps they realized after all that the hall was too small, like I said, and then they built another one. Just moving into the outer ward, there are some more interesting things here too. So firstly, while the inner ward received improved stone fortifications in the late 12th century, the outer ward kept its timber defences until the 14th century, when it finally received its own stone wall. Then following Owain Glyndwr's attack in the 15th century, the outer ward was strengthened even further with the addition of a south gatehouse and a west gatehouse. It's the west gatehouse of the outer ward that now acts as the main entrance to the castle today. Also added around this time were these arrow loops on the south wall. These are narrow openings where defenders could shoot arrows at attacking forces while exposing as little of themselves as possible. A large barn was also built in the outer ward in the 15th century. Not much really remains now other than its footprint, but it's clear this was not, a small barn. This was a substantial building. It's one of the largest buildings in the castle. And like the domestic range, this was another part of the practical side of castle life. You'd have sacks of grain, hay for animals, rent paid in produce, tools, carts and supplies. They would have all been stored here. Coity may have been a fortress, but it was also a centre of a working estate, somewhere that had to feed people and manage land and collect rents and keep the whole household running. Now in the late 16th century, Coity passed through marriage from the Gamage family to the Sidney family, but the new owners preferred to live on their property in England. This was unfortunately the beginning of the end for the castle. It was eventually abandoned in the early 18th century, and as this engraving from 1740 shows, it had started to fall into disrepair shortly after. This second engraving shows that by 1853, it was already significantly ruined, and it's been that way ever since. And that's Coity Castle, a medieval ruin found behind hedges in a quiet housing estate. It began as a Norman earth ringwork over 900 years ago, became a stone fortress, survived Owain Glyndŵr's uprising, became the prize in a bitter inheritance dispute, and was then reshaped into a more comfortable residence for the families who controlled it. It was a home, a workplace, a symbol of power, and the centre of a medieval estate. And it's so easy to just drive past it and forget how amazing and how interesting a place it is. The people around here, they just wake up, open their curtains, and they see a medieval castle. Crazy. Anyway, I found that interesting. I hope you found that interesting too. If you did, then great. If you didn't, then I'm sorry. I can't give you that time back, I'm afraid. But maybe if you subscribe, maybe in the future I'll do something that you do find interesting, and then everyone's a winner. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Bye.